everybody has this indelible image of these planes flying into the Twin Towers. It's just in your mind. So it's the psychological combined with the visual jolt of it, and its unintelligibility. I mean, just boom. There's no warning behind it, no threat, just boom. And so it's got this, had originally this quality of what's happening, of irrationality, so it was scary, because this event wasn't explained. One didn't know what else was going to happen. That was the initial response. It seems that was certainly my initial response. A good deal of the American response was the wish for revenge, retribution, payback. I think what we Americans did not do much of is ask why they were so angry at us. I mean, it takes no insight to see that there was somebody who was exceedingly angry at us who perpetrated this. I think instead of just paying back in such a case, one ought to, after a bit of time has elapsed, of course, you can't do it right away, ask why are they so angry at us, and then get yourself into a position where you're able to say, is there any justice whatsoever in their anger, or is it just misguided? I don't think we Americans were very good at that background attempt to understand that background. Why are they so angry? And is there any justice whatsoever in their anger? And if so, what should we do to change things? For a century, there's been the so-called secularization thesis, which has attracted very many academics. The thesis was this. Max Weber was a proponent, the great turn of the last century sociologist, that as societies become modernized, religion becomes privatized, and eventually, since it plays no social role anymore, just disappears. So modernization produces secularization. A little bit more to it, the problems that traditional religion supposedly helped us to cope with are now dealt with by technology and so forth. There are very few sociologists and political scientists and historians who would any longer defend that secularization thesis. It just seems flamboyantly false. And if it did not seem flamboyantly false before 9/11, it certainly seems false after 9/11. The problem, if that's a problem, is not the disappearance of religion, but it's popping up in all kinds of unexpected places. So I think most people nowadays would say that modernization forces religion to change, but it doesn't cause its disappearance. Religion in a technological society is different from religion in a more tribal society, pre-technological society, but it's there just the same. It can now use airplanes as its instruments of death, as opposed to spears. If one expects religion to disappear, if one fully expects it to prove to be a relic of earlier days, and first it becomes privatized and then disappears, then tolerance is, well, in the interim you want tolerance, but it's no big deal, right? If religion's going to disappear, you don't have to work hard at people tolerating each other's religion. But when we become convinced that it's not going to disappear, and that religion comes in the form of religions, not just in the form of religion, then tolerance becomes of utmost importance. And my own view is this. Some people think that tolerance has to be achieved by giving up so-called a supersessionist view of one's religion, that one's own religion is superior to the others. If we have to wait until that happens, in the meanwhile we're not going to tolerate each other, it seems to me that we're going to wait forever. Religious people are not going to say other people's religions are just as, most religious people are not going to say that other people's religions are just as true and valuable as my own. I mean, there will be some who say that all paths lead to God, but most people won't. So tolerance becomes crucial, and I understand tolerance this way. You're not tolerating the other person's religion if you find it interesting. How interesting to have a Hindu in the area. Well, that's not tolerance. That's, I don't know what to call that. You're not tolerant if you're indifferent, if you couldn't care less. You're tolerant if you disapprove of the other person's religion, but put up with it nonetheless. That curious combination, it seems to me, not easy to bring off in general for a lot of people. That curious combination, disapproving of your religion, not just finding it interesting or being indifferent, disapproving, but putting up with you, getting along with you. It seems to me if you just find the other religions interesting, that's not tolerance. That's, I don't know what to call it, doesn't really have a name. Or if you couldn't care less. It's when the other person, their religion, you don't like it, you think it's inferior, you disapprove of it. In some ways you wish that they didn't have that religion, but they had your own or whatever. Then to get along with you nonetheless. And so how can we, it seems to me the big question is how can we in general bring off that not easy to achieve combination? Historically, what has led to tolerance is just that so much blood was being shed by the absent policy that one just throws up one's hands after a while and say, well, this can't go on. I wish you held my own religion, but we got to stop the killing. But that's not a resource within one's own religion, of course. That's just the utterly pragmatic, but nonetheless, absolutely important consideration. This way of intolerance is too bloody for everybody. So I think each religion has to answer that question for itself. What are the resources within its own religion? Jews have to answer it for Jews, and Muslims for Muslims, and Christians for Christians. Those who are learned in the other religions can surmise, no doubt, what the answer would be, but at bottom we got to answer it for ourselves. And I speak as a Christian, and it seems to me that there are at least two powerful resources in Christianity for tolerance. These have not always been recognized, obviously, but there they are. One is the fact that every human being has been created in the image of God and is redemptively loved by God. A human being cannot erase that. No matter how much of a moral scoundrel they may be, or no matter what religion that you don't like they may profess, nonetheless, they have this feature and this relationship about them. They're created in the image of God and redemptively loved by God. And it seems to me that if you ask, what are the implications of that? How do I give due recognition to the fact that this other human being has those relationships to God? Then tolerance has to flow from it. Intolerance, trying to reduce you to second-class citizenship, driving you out of the country, all such strategies of intolerance strike me as just incompatible with recognition of this deep worth that every human being has on account of those two relationships, bearing the image of God and being redemptively loved by God. And the second one is the centrality of the love command in Christianity. In all three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, somewhat querulous interrogators come up to Jesus and ask, what's the greatest in the Torah? And obviously they expected Jesus to flunk the answer to this question, this test question. But he gives them the two love commands, love God above all and love your neighbor as yourself, and they concede that this is indeed the two greatest in the Torah. And then Jesus fleshes it out, and Paul in his letters fleshes it out, and other letter writers in the New Testament flesh it out. What this means is that even if the neighbor is your enemy, you are to love him. Not return evil for evil, that is harm for harm, but always respond with good. That is, now it's acquired a warm, fuzzy feel, of course. Love your neighbor as yourself, even if that neighbor be your enemy. But when you think about its implications, they are jolting. This is what it amounts to. Jesus, did I hear you right? There's this guy, Osama bin Laden, my enemy, our enemy. You mean I should pray for and love him? I don't think Jesus or Paul or the other letter writers give us any wiggle room. That's what they say. Love your neighbor even if that neighbor be your enemy. Pick your favorite enemy. Most Christians have held that Christians and Jews worship the same God. It's hard to hold a different view if you include the Old Testament Hebrew Bible in your canon. But with Islam, it's been different. Medieval Christians, the ones who wrote, to the best of my knowledge, almost always thought that both Jews and Muslims worship the same God as Christians. Have really significantly different views about this God and about God's relationship to Jesus and so forth, but still, it's the same God. I think it's pretty clear that a good many modern-day American evangelicals do not think that. They have picked up the idea that Muslims worship a different God, and that hence Islam is a kind of idolatry. And if you think that Islam is idolatry, tolerance is going to be a very different and more difficult project for you than if you think that Muslims worship the same God, but have different views about that God and about that God's relationship to Jesus Christ and so forth. So I think that's the deep theological issue. Evangelicals have not used these 10 years to wrestle with that deep question. They've just let it sit there, I think, my impression, with the common view that they worship a different God and hence they are basically idolaters. And that gets combined with fear. If you don't have Muslims in your neighborhood and if you're not talking to them, I think there's no doubt that what mainly comes through about Islam in the American media and American press is fearsome. We don't see any other side of Islam, and so the fear is, sad to say, understandable. So a crucial part of actually coming to the point of tolerance, of being willing to tolerate your Muslim neighbor, is talking to him or her. That doesn't always work. The Muslim that you talk to might in fact be quite fearsome, just as the Christian that you talk to might be quite fearsome. And you may have a mental set such that you just discard all senses of humanity in this fellow human being. You just don't allow for it. I'm reminded of what people said when integration was first introduced into the U.S. Army. People said, oh, blacks and whites will start getting along with each other. Well, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes when you put them together, this served to confirm their prejudices. Over the long haul, that has to be how it is. So I would say what we have to do is start talking to each other, talking seriously to each other at all levels, academics, then all the way down to the people in your neighborhood. Invite them over. They're human beings. Find out what they believe, what they're like, what they dislike, what they like about America, what they don't like about America. And you respond in turn. I think that interchange at all levels is indispensable to coming to the point of true tolerance. I think what's becoming clear to most Americans now is that we cannot live in a state of perpetual war. It's too, if nothing else, it's too expensive. We can't afford it. And that's a sort of gross reason, but but a lot of people are persuaded by it. We just cannot sustain it. And so I think more and more voices are saying we've got to find an end to running around the world and trying to be the cop. From a theological point of view, so I belong to the just war tradition, not to the pacifist tradition. I'm willing to say that there are cases in which it's right to go to war. Almost always what makes it right is that you are defending yourself as opposed to attacking. Not even every case of defense is a case of just warfare. I think when the Netherlands surrendered to the Nazis after the bombing of Rotterdam in 1940, they simply had to calculate which will be the more destructive, fighting to the death of our people, fighting as long as we can, or surrendering. And they calculated, and I think rightly, that surrender was best. And I think that's still the correct judgment, even after we see all the horrors that the Nazis perpetrated on the Dutch, of hauling the Jews off to concentration camps and so forth. But that's a judgment call. So in the just war tradition, one always asks whether the cause of justice, and many different dimensions to that, it's probably best not to go into all the different dimensions right now, whether the cause of justice is served by this act of war overall. And I'm dubious that the cause of justice was served overall by either the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War. Now, when I say overall, so we've got to take into account the deaths of the Iraqis, the deaths of the Americans, the financial cost to both sides, all of that. And when you pile all that up, it's not so clear that this was a just war. But that's the question that the Christian in my tradition will want to ask. I'm not sure how many Americans are inclined to ask the question. I think we're much more inclined just to think nationalistically. Will it serve national interest? Though I have a philosopher friend, who teaches philosophy at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. He tells me that the official philosophy taught in all the academies is the just war philosophy. So our servicemen think in these terms, or are taught to think in these terms. Beneath the surface, there are big moral issues in the health insurance debate, and beneath the surface, there are big moral issues in whether to go to war. But we Americans are reluctant to bring those moral issues to the surface in public. We'll do so in private, in churches and homes and so forth, in some schools, I suppose, but not in public. I challenge anybody to find very much of talk about justice and so forth in the recent healthcare debate. So why is this? I have no good answer to that question. We're just afraid to discuss it in moral terms, or we think we'll disagree too much, but we disagree anyway. So you see what I'm saying? That the same phenomenon, it seems to me, comes to the surface both in these big social programs, which raise big moral issues, and issues of warfare and nation building around the world and so forth. Deep moral issues which we're shy of talking about in public. I think that before 9/11, I was, like most of my fellow Americans, aware of Islam, but there it is, no big deal. 9/11 put it on my doorstep, put it on everybody's doorstep. Didn't put it on our doorstep in a way that conduced serious reflection, because they just loaded the airplanes, they crashed them into the buildings, never officially explained why and so forth. So we were left to figure it out and find out and so forth. But I think what 9/11 did for me and for all my fellow Americans is it jolted us into the reality, realizing that Islam is just not out there, it's here, and we have to learn how to deal with it. We can no longer just ignore it. We have to learn how to live with it, both amongst ourselves and in the world. That's the change that it produced in me. I'm a philosopher and know something of the history of philosophy. What strikes me whenever I dip back into medieval philosophy is that there was far more engagement, at least on the academic level, among Jewish scholars in Spain, Latin, Western scholars in, Italy and France and so forth, and Islamic scholars. There was all kinds of interaction. And I suppose it was Islam's threatening the gates of Vienna that gave it this fearsome face to the West. And in the intervening centuries, most of us have tried to keep it at arm's length. But now it came into our face in a most dramatic and alarming fashion, and we have to engage it.